It's often stated in Alberta that the province has very clean natural gas that should be made into clean LNG. And what they really mean is that not only does natural gas produce half the CO2 that coal does when it's burned, but also that it has very little leaks, fugitive methane emissions from production and transportation. But in fact, that is not the case. We've known for a long time that the system is actually pretty leaky, and the governments have committed, both the Alberta government and the federal government, to reduce those leaks by 75%. But a persistent problem is, how do you measure them? Are the measurements accurate? Because the consensus is that the data is wildly inaccurate. And I'm going to talk to Jan Gorski, who is the director of the Pembina Institute's oil and gas program, about the 2021 Alberta methane emission report. So welcome to the interview, Jan.
Thanks, Markham. Happy to be here.
Look, I'll tell you what stood out for me in this report, because methane emissions, has been a big debate about it for a long time. It's generally considered that this is the low-hanging fruit of greenhouse gases from the industry, and the industry produces 26% of all of Canada's greenhouse gases. So this is a big issue. The big problem in measurement has been technology, because the way inspectors they go out once or twice a year to a well site or a battery, and they have these little thermal, they're like a little thermal gun, and they would take measurements from the well, and they have other similar tools that they use for tanks, and then that would be the measurement. The problem is that studies over and over again have shown that you can't measure methane emission leaks on a one-time basis. They're not consistent. What's leaking? You might have a little leak today and a big leak tomorrow, and next week something breaks and you have a huge leak. And this particular report, the inspectors still are relying on that old technology. And now, have I got this correct?
Yeah, this is, I think there's a couple of interesting trends we want to tease out here. First of all, I think it's important to acknowledge that there's progress being made, that methane emissions are going down. And that to me shows that regulations are starting to work. And there's an opportunity, as you said, methane continues to be the low-hanging fruit. And there's an opportunity to go further, to put in place more ambitious regulations to get deeper reductions in methane emissions. But as you say, we do still have this challenge in that we still don't accurately know the numbers. So there's room to improve the way that we measure methane emissions and the way that companies report methane emissions. And as we head into this next batch of policy development, the federal government and provincial governments are starting to develop new methane regulations. It's important to improve the way that we measure and report methane emissions, both at the industry level, but also at the government level.
Okay. The instruments that I referred to as thermal guns is not quite accurate. They're optical gas imaging cameras. They just look like little guns. That's what I was getting at. So let's talk about how these measurements get taken. There are 5 field centers in Alberta with 1 or 2 inspectors on site, and then there's a couple in the Calgary office, and they go out and spend about half of their time doing these methane inspections. They did 850 inspections in 2021. The problem is there are well over 100,000 wells in Alberta, and then on top of the wells, there are pipelines that can leak. There are processing plants that can leak. There are tanks that can leak. There's all sorts of equipment, all sorts of places in the upstream and transportation system where those leaks can take place. And 850 seems like a very low number to me.
Well, as you said, part of the challenge is technology. We're still using these infrared cameras because that's the best thing we had 2 or 3 years ago. But now we're starting to see new technologies come onto the market We're starting to see satellites, airplane sensors, truck-based sensors, new measurement methods that can give us a better picture of methane emissions across the province much faster. And as I said, I think we need to shift towards that. There's still going to be a role for those old infrared cameras, because at the end of the day, once you find a source of emissions, you have to pinpoint it. A satellite will tell you, within 10 kilometers where that leak might be. An airplane might tell you in a kilometer, but you still need to go on site to find precisely where it is. So you'll still need those cameras, but we now need to start implementing these new technologies to be able to more rapidly detect these large sources of emissions.
Okay, I understand why satellites have limited uses. They're kind of blunt instruments, as it were, and same with aerial flyovers. And that was now, and I think it's important. The report does not mention satellite data, so it doesn't appear that any of the data came from satellites, as far as we could tell. It does mention aerial surveillance, but doesn't mention what percentage that made up of the various inspections. But this technology, the newer technologies that we're talking about, have been around. It's not like they came out in 2021. They've been around for a while now. And the one that I don't understand it showing up here, and that is remote sensing data. Remote sensors that will then, you can put them on your battery, you can put them by the well, you can put them in your various parts of your facilities, and you can feed real-time data back to your operating system, put it up in the cloud, and then have operators analyze it later, and that are we, like, and when I say we, I mean, is Alberta taking full advantage of that technology?
I think that's the up and coming technology that, in two to 4 years will be commonplace. But right now we're still trying to test and figure out how to incorporate that technology into the way that we measure emissions and into the way that we address methane emissions. So I don't think we're there yet. There's still room for improvement. There's still room to incorporate some of these new technologies. As you said, some of them are ready. Even Alberta has said that they are using aerial technology. The continuous monitors that you're talking about, I don't think are quite there. They're close, but we're not quite ready to deploy them yet. But they'll be a key part of the solution going forward.
Okay, so Alberta's a little behind other jurisdictions that are already been adopting these, and which kind of flies in the face of the narrative that we hear from the industry and the politicians, where Alberta is on the forefront and it's all environmentally friendly. Now, out of those 850 methane inspections, 224 of the inspections resulted in notices of non-compliance. So that's about, what, 30% roughly, where there's non-compliance. So they exceeded the limits that were allowed. That seems to me to be a very high percentage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's something that we have to improve as well. We have to improve the way that we enforce some of these rules. And part of this, as you said, is the challenge right now is the technology that we're using right now. You can find the leaks, but it's difficult to measure the quantity of leaks. And this is why we need to get to a point where we're incorporating these new technologies that allow the government to actually measure emission sources and enforce them better.
Right, except that they're not enforcing them. What they do is they send them out a letter and they say, tut, 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 Mr. Oil Company, we noticed that you have exceeded the limit, and there's a provincial limit that that's set in the regulations. Tut, 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 and we expect you to do better next time. Why aren't there penalties? Why is the government not saying you exceeded the limit? Now there's going to be a penalty to make sure, and we'll be back next year to make sure, to follow up that make sure that you fix the problem.
Yeah, it's a good question. To be honest, I don't have an answer as to why this is happening, but it's certainly a challenge that we have to overcome.
Yeah, no kidding. And here's another challenge that we need to overcome is under the Alberta environment is going the same route as the Alberta Energy Regulator, which basically means that they allow a lot of the companies to self-report the amount of the emissions data that they have. And what we found with the AER is that it's not true for every company, but we don't really know how many companies are gaming the system. They're entering inaccurate data. They're literally lying in their data. And then the Alberta Environment, in this case, then goes back and does a desktop review of that data. But that review is only as good as the data the oil and gas companies provided. So there's another weak spot that, I'm at the point now, I look at this report, Jan, and it doesn't mean anything. There's so many qualifications, so many holes in the measurement and the enforcement and the evaluation that I don't know that we can trust anything that's in this report.
Well, I think you're right here in that we do need better data, and there's a responsibility to here as we create new regulations, both to require companies to collect, to measure, and report better data, but we also need the government itself to be going out and doing more measurements and monitoring to see what's happening on the ground and to reconcile what they're hearing from companies, what companies are reporting with what their own data is showing. So that's what we need to move towards as policy on methane continues to advance.
I'll tell you where I think we need to go, and that is we're going to need remote sensors for every well and every piece of equipment, and there has to be some kind of a blockchain verification to make sure that that data that is collected is actually winds up getting is legitimate and hasn't been tampered with or somehow corrupted. And then somebody at the government, within the environment department, is going to have to sit down and crunch the numbers, because at this point in the game, it's pretty weak, I have to say. And I come at this from a different point of view than you do, because you work with industry, you work with the government on these issues all the time. I come at it from the other end, where as a journalist, I hear the narrative and I hear the stories and the claims in press releases and in public comments made by industry and government. And there's a big gap between what gets claimed and what's happening on the ground. So that's, I don't know. Is that a fair way to sum it up?
I think it's fair to say that, we need to move towards better measurement and monitoring of methane emissions. We need to collect better data. And as you said, one of the big challenges is the more data you have, you now need systems to be able to analyze and process all that data and make something meaningful out of it as well. But I'm confident that there's a lot of good work going on in this space right now in Canada and in the US, and that we're ready to make that leap in the next set of methane regulations that we pursue in Canada and in Alberta.
Okay, well, you're taking the optimistic view. I'm going to take the pessimistic view. Fair enough. Jan, thank you very much. Always a pleasure.
Likewise. Thank you, Markham.